Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jessica Byron. I am the director of the Institute of International Relations, and it gives me great pleasure first to welcome our distinguished speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Patrick Gomes, former Secretary General of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group, now the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Gomes very sincerely for his generous response to our invitation to do this dialogue and to share his perspectives with us on European Union and ACP relations. We are living through a period of major changes in global affairs, and it is very important to examine the implications of this period for all our very important historical relationships as well as newer ones. And of course, the relationship between the European Union and the ACP has a 40-year period of duration. It has been one of the most important external relationships for the Caribbean. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your insights today. I welcome all members of the U.W.I community, including the Institute of International Relations students and staff who are with us today. And I extend a special welcome to our alumni and our external stakeholders, many of them very distinguished members of our community who are here, our partners in Trinidad and Tobago and around the Caribbean and further afield who have joined this webinar. It is a pleasure to have you all, and we look forward to a stimulating exchange. I now call on Dr. Anita Montoute to properly introduce our guest speaker this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon to all our listeners and persons attending this seminar this afternoon. It is with great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Patrick Ignatius Gomes of Guyana, who was elected the Secretary General of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group of States by the group's Council of Ministers on December 10, 2014 for the period 2015 to 2020. Prior to taking up his position as Secretary General, ACP Secretary General, Dr. Gomes served as Guyana's ambassador to Belgium and the European Union, and as Guyana's representative to the World Trade Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization from 2005 to 2015. He was a member of the Faculty of Agriculture, serving in the Department of Agricultural Extension at the U.W.I. St. Augustine from 1974 to 2000, and was appointed Executive Director of the Caribbean Center for Development Administration in Barbados from 2000 to 2014. He holds an MA and PhD in Social Institutions and Processes from Fordham University, New York, in the USA. Dr. Gomes has also worked as a senior advisor in human resources and higher education development at UN-ECLAC, Port of Spain. He has authored publications in the areas of technology policy and development and social policy analysis, and served as chairman of the Board of Governors for the Maastricht-based think tank, European Center for Development Policy Management, the ECDPM. And something Dr. Gomes will not tell us is how an excellent ambassador he was. I was privileged to see him when I worked as a fellow at the ECDPM in the European Parliament. And after I had heard some demoralizing things and I heard Ambassador Gomes make a presentation in the European Parliament, I was extremely proud to be a Caribbean person. So it gives me great pleasure, Ambassador, to be the one to introduce you and welcome you to update us on these very important developments in EU-ACP relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, dear Jessica, as Director of the Institute. I appreciate your warm welcome, and I also realize that you plan to have thunder and rain as I was coming to the Institute, so welcome also, and appreciate that very much. To Dr. Montut and Anita, I want to put on record how much I admire the progressive way in which your career is developing and the work you're doing. And I suspect that the short time you spent as a fellow at the European Center in Maastricht could have contributed to that. To other members of the university community, after spending 16 years here, I'm happy to be back once again and to be graciously welcomed with this invitation. I also want to welcome our friends and colleagues who are following this webinar in the CARICOM, in CARIFORUM, and even further afield. Present with us here in the room is Dr. Harak Singh, and I think that's the great privilege and honor that Dr. Harak Singh, who spoke with us a week ago in a webinar from here, has been a very accomplished legal advisor and consultant to the work that the ACP has been doing. I believe now after 45 years, the relationship between the ACP and the EU has evolved with a considerable accumulation of trade, development of assistance, and what has been captured in political dialogues under, more recently, the Cotonou Agreement, and the negotiations about which we will speak very briefly, as they are now ongoing, tend to address a very indicative and explanatory manner what the outcome can be for this relationship in the 21st century. The tasks facing, therefore, the ACP and the EU amount to defining provisions to guide this new arrangement in the 21st century and beyond in a way that serves the mutual interests of both the ACP in its reincarnation as an international organization of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. What we have, therefore, and what is fascinating and quite unique is the intercontinental or the transcontinental intergovernmental 78 member states who are participating in the current negotiations. Though the total membership is 79, Cuba does not participate in the agreement, but is a full member and has been a member of the ACP since 2000. Now, to understand a bit of the socioeconomic and the political character of these two entities, Europe faces, as a supranational entity, and sometimes referred to as the world's largest trading bloc, it is now battling really to reassert its space when it is caught between what we can say as the emerging superpower of Mr. Xi Jinping's China, and I wanted to say a disoriented USA, but I have to be cautious on that. But it's certainly a USA that is also going through a transformation and is likely to do so in a more significant way 1 week from today, one way or the other. To understand, therefore, the character and the background and the institutional arrangements required some attention, I believe, to ideologically what has been underlying how these two organizations have sought to fulfill the interests of their populations and at the same time share a partnership. But this commonality of interest must be based, as it has been, on the Charter of the United Nations, recognizing on that basis the equality of sovereign states, but at the same time requiring that we acknowledge there is an asymmetrical relationship given the trade, the commercial, the military, and the technological advantage that the EU presents in this relationship. The presentation, therefore, that I want to share with you today in these thoughts will look at context, the process that is at work, highlight some of the structure and strategic priorities as the institutional and thematic areas of the negotiations, and also the three regional protocols. The latter, together with the general part of the new agreement, will constitute a single undertaking. And that is most important for us to keep in mind. I propose also in some concluding remarks that it may be useful to raise how does the Caribbean of today, envisage being engaged so that it could add value to this new phase of the ACNP, because at the outset, the Canada played a most significant part in what the ACP has become. And we would want to ask, how does the Caribbean play its role also with other members of the ACP, how it relates to Africa, continental and regionally, and also the Pacific. Therefore, the context, if I would say, allows me to highlight a bit of what is covered in the first slide under a few points that refer to thanks for that slide. It helps me to remember, in fact, what we want to cover under this concept of the context. Namely, briefly refer to Lomé and Cotonou, which is the transition now, but also highlight the negotiation process in terms of its core principles, some work that had to be done as an outreach on the part of the ACP, almost to counter an outreach that had been envisaged by the European Union in how they were expressing contrasting views on what should become of a success agreement. I would like to touch also on the council mandate and how it was formulated and why what has taken on a new term, and in the negotiations itself, that this is a member-driven process, and it will be a member-driven new agreement. I would want to touch a bit on the ACP framework and its relationships in terms of the African Union and the European Union, and also identify what was covered in the formal launching. But before doing so, I want to thank Dr. Harak Singh for setting the appropriate overview of the background and objectives that inspired a revision of the Georgetown Agreement in the evolution of the ACP as an intergovernmental entity. The official name of the OACPS came into effect in April this year, once the requisite number of signatories had been provided. But the process and the outcome of that revised Georgetown Agreement are part and parcel of this dynamic context and the accumulation of the intellectual capital of the 79 development countries, which have been enriched by their trade and development experiences over those 4 decades. These are really contributing factors, and that is why I put emphasis on the context, because it is in that context that we see the unity on solidarity of the ACP as making it possible for driving an extensive preparatory process to become fit and proper in how an engagement that will be fruitful for the member states of the ACNP. Preparing to negotiate required, therefore, the strength and a deeper self-consciousness, and also the reassurance of heads of state and government with political will to support what would become the new agreement. Put differently, I see the revised Georgetown Agreement that marked a significant milestone as indicating a maturing of the self-understanding and the identity of the ACP. And that was really captured as part of our preparatory phase or stage in the document that is the policy document called Towards the ACP We Want. It portrays the identity, what we can say as a relative autonomy by the ACP and freeing itself of an aid dependency and the apparent heavy reliance on the EU patronage. Sometimes the document has been able to capture the document, the ACP We Want, and all the documents that I referred to are available, and the students may benefit very much by consulting the website of the ACP, www.acp.int. It enriches, therefore, the thinking of what was going into the reflections required to strengthen the ACP on the basis of its unity and solidarity to engage with the European Union. The document, therefore, attempted to clarify the process of reinventing and repositioning the ACP. It is a process which I was happy to join in that had been preceded by a former chair of the Committee of Ambassadors, a former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, and then also there was a former ambassador from Mauritius, but also those who had been very rich and steeped in the work of the ACP but at the same time, recognizing the time had come for both the coherence, the strength of the unity and solidarity to reposition the ACP to become a more influential global player. Transforming the ACP group into an effective global player became the theme of the work that the Ambassador Working Group had put together. The opportunities, therefore, that have been identified in that policy document towards the ACP we want looked at the preparations and negotiations that had also been a part of what took place in the transition between Lomé, the first agreement of 1975 to 2000, and the beginning of Cotonou. But it also touched on the way in which, moving from the export of primary commodities, the relationship of our trade and the value addition of primary commodities of the ACP countries had to require participation in global value chains. In other words, it also identified ways by which there will be other sources of trade negotiations that should be pursued in the future as the ACP becomes the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. For instance, reference was made to work that the ACP had been contributing in a significant way to the COP, or the process of the Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and significantly using its convening authority, prepared issues papers that assisted in preparations for those who would be negotiating. Similarly, the document reviewed and recommended strategic approaches to strengthen what would be the substantive thematic areas to drive the repositioned ACP as an effective global player. But at the same time, it recognized that the overarching framework would in fact be the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. The comprehensive preparations required an adequate appreciation of the prevailing international, regional, and national context in which the ACP was situated. This enabled recognition that the document should look at what is an unpredictable and increasingly turbulent environment and a global community confronted with a number of challenges, such as migration, how to deal with the rule of law, and increasing respect for human rights. At the same time, other issues attempted to identify the context by which a post-Cotonou agreement would be shaped, reducing not only the aid dependency, but understanding trade in a new way. And that is why in the document towards the ACP we want, the decades of political dialogue came to the fore in recognizing cultural understanding and cooperation among peoples of varied religious, cultural, ideological orientations, a bearing on what is referred to as now radicalization and terrorism. But this commitment was also identified as one of the objectives early on in the Georgetown Agreement, but had not been to the fore very much in the activities undertaken. So focused the activities had been around trade and development assistance. The commitment also to remain united in solidarity is a fundamental tenet that has characterized the ACP group from its outset. By opting for a collective approach in 1975, what had come about with the diverse countries recently independent in sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, we were able to secure from the European Economic Community a non-reciprocal trade arrangement and some substantial development aid. But that should not overlook the fact of its deficiencies and also the bureaucratic obstacles that remain constraints to how our agriculture and mineral commodities in their primary form did not allow or only allowed for very little value addition. The basis for manufacturing and structural transformation of ACP economies had to be consistently fought for, realizing a partial success from the value chain approach, only to be realized when we came to 2017 as a formal pronouncement by our council. At that time, early on, the ACP had convinced the EEC, at that time, the European Economic Community, to accept the grouping as a suitable vehicle for negotiation and engagement. Applicable as it was at that time, in 2002, when a requirement, given the pressure of the WTO, found it necessary that non-reciprocal trade had to be adjusted, what was introduced were called economic partnership agreements. Those were a significant setback and arose from very regrettable actions resulting on the part of the EU in attempts to fragment the ACP in how the negotiations of the EPAs were undertaken. In many ways, we have to be honest and say this became a major blow to ACP unity and solidarity, and whereby tensions were experienced in Brussels and even within the regions for some time. In other words, though the principle of unity and solidarity underlies what has held the group together, it does not mean it hasn't faced serious obstacles, but have resolved them to build on a higher level. Partially remedied were the differences in the summit of heads of state held in Accra in 2008, but the tensions remained after in regional groupings. Significantly, though, the summit saw it necessary that contacts and relations with other states and groups of states need to be considered and taken into account, but also re-emphasized that the conditions to make our group an influential player in economic governance and global policy would be important. That seminal document, therefore, towards the ACP we want, became the policy framework for the advancement and acceleration of the preparatory process in looking at how we would approach post-Cotonou negotiations, and was adopted by our Council of Ministers in 2016. The substantive value of the process rests on the proposal of 3 strategic pillars that were put forward in that document. And also it outlined preliminary drafting instructions for a review of the Georgetown Agreement. And the drafting of those instructions were what we found culminating in the great work that Dr. Harak Singh has contributed in the revised Georgetown Agreement. So as early as 2016, and in the document towards the ACP we want, the thinking and reflection to drive the process was seeing a repositioned, a reinvented ACP. The 3 strategic pillars were a reformulation, not trade alone, or trade and aid, but trade, investment, industrialization, and services had to be one pillar. The second pillar is not aid, but we stopped speaking of aid, but development cooperation. And linked to that was technology, science, innovation, research. And finally, policy and political dialogue and advocacy recrafted. Those 3 strategic pillars would subsequently become the core thematic areas of the ACP's negotiating mandate. In that mandate, therefore, is expressed the guiding principles for the negotiations, the objectives of a post-Cotonou agreement, and cross-cutting themes. Those themes are identified as important for the simple reason that we would move away from being in silos operating, but seeing a broader perspective of sustainable development. Now, the ACP negotiating mandate was captured and prepared in a document that also is one to which I'd like to refer our students, called and cited and available on the website, adopted as the basis by which we would enter into agreements. On the part, therefore, of the ACP, a state of readiness to engage in discussions for the negotiation process had been reached by 2017, when the Council in its session, in fact, adopted the mandate, and our host country of that meeting in Togo named our chief negotiator for the negotiations as the foreign minister of the Togolese Republic. Let me, though, briefly refer to what became some intervening issues prior to the engagement. The first of which refers to a concern on the part of Europe through its European Commission to mount what would be lobbying missions to go to the heads of state asking or soliciting their views on what form should the new agreement take. The leaning there, in fact, had an undercurrent, at sometimes not so under, but very explicit, that it was to negotiate with Africa alone and let the C and the P, as an advisor of one of the most prominent member states of Europe, would have said, the Caribbean and Pacific causes Europe no problems with its migrants. You are basically middle-income countries, but we have a very special relationship with Africa. We have, therefore, a tendency, and the tendency was there, and that mission had been, in fact, soliciting the heads of state of the ACP that could have carried the negotiations in a different direction. The ACP proactively did a series of outreach missions and advanced a very basic and simple position paper that said, we must identify and remain united, and it is on the basis as a united entity, trans-regional, we will negotiate a success agreement. It will also be formally structured with regional and continental groupings of other developing countries, but also display a structured relationship around its 6 regions, 4 of Africa, the Caribbean and Pacific, while being open to different types of association with other developing countries. And it was to be, in fact, a legally binding agreement, a treaty, as Cotonou has been, and in which we will expect to see a development finance mechanism. The significance of that aid memoir and the basic principles by which we canvassed heads of state would come to play a most significant part in the tensions that arose. Having therefore adopted the mandate of the ACP for a single undertaking based on 3 strategic pillars, the mandate therefore was ready to proceed, but we could not do so because on the other side, the Europeans' directives at that time spoke of finding in the relationship one which would speak to 3 regional pillars or 3 regional partnerships. That again came to or amounted to almost a fragmentation of the ACP. The disagreement, therefore, on a common structure on which negotiations would be based arose from those directives and had to be countered and repeatedly argued against. For the simple reason that our council, which gave directions, had already agreed upon a mandate in which there was no reference at all to the regions having such an item as specific regional pillars. It was necessary, therefore, to negotiate, and eventually it was recognized that what would be, in order to avoid a repeat of the economic partnership agreements, approval of a mandate without reference to regional pillars would need and require an amendment by our council. But the summit, both in Malabo 2012, Port Moresby in 2016, once again repeated that we would remain united as an intergovernmental organization, and as a trans-regional entity, we will negotiate a success agreement. Eventually, therefore, the rejection of the EU's directives and subsequent negotiations resulted in accepting the principle that the structure of the post-2020 agreement will be composed of a foundation or a general part with annexes and 6 regional protocols, making or comprising a single undertaking that would be a legally binding agreement. Again, this was an important victory for unity on solidarity. On that understanding, therefore, while the regional pillars and the regional protocols allow us to have what are the commonalities across the 79 countries, it also gives attention to what could be specificities. On that basis, the movement towards the preparations for negotiations allowed us to look at formally launching our negotiations on 2 dimensions, one of which was the joint mandate, and secondly, that we would be looking at this new agreement within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. I have another slide that attempts to illustrate some of the commonalities and also where there are differences. To shift, therefore, now to the structure of the agreement, having agreed, therefore, and the formally putting together the consideration for how we could launch and proceed with a negotiating text, the structured agreement took the shape of what can be conveyed as mainly a general part with the provisions, strategic priorities. And under those strategic priorities, 6 titles or subjects are listed. And I think it's important for us to grasp the way in which these have been captured and also what they say, without going into the details in the substance of those strategic priorities for the general agreement as a whole. Human rights, people-centered, and rights-based societies feature very prominently. Again, reflecting the fact that it is not primarily a trade and aid agreement that this will be based on, but addressing broad concerns about the quality of life in society, the rule of law, and good governance. Secondly, issues of peace and security, as much as concerned globally, as concerned in our regions, and concerned with variations in different ways, but most certainly a concern for the African continent, and to some extent in the securities we face now from our borders and what happens. Peace and security became therefore an important part or a title to which attention is given in the new agreement. Thirdly, human and social development, broad ranging that covers large sections that enable us to see the way in which education, culture, cross-cutting themes, social cohesion, and several aspects. And there is where I think capacity building and higher education research can be taken into account. The fourth area then comes back to a new understanding of trade as an instrument of development, but within the context of inclusive, sustainable economic growth and development, featuring prominently among which are industrialization, among which are diversification, and also sections would touch on those parts that deal with trade in services and trade cooperation, giving room to seeing the EPAs where they can be supported as best, but not in any way the compulsory basis for regional trade agreements. The following item touches on environmental sustainability and climate change. Remarkably important for us, both in terms of global responsibility, but by the very structure of the ACP, with 31 of our member states between the Caribbean, primarily islands or the coastal states, but also in the Pacific, and the ways in which that entire issue of environmental sustainability and climate change has been an area of widely recognized contribution of the ACP, if not negotiating, but certainly playing a significant part. The most significant part played in forming which was the Ambition Coalition. As is recorded, without an Ambition Coalition, the Paris Agreement could not have been signed. The Paris Agreement signed had at its core the membership of the ACP and the European Union. That has been a significant contribution in which the continuing work around climate and climate aspects are an area or a niche in which there is much work and great tribute for the work to be done, both within the ACP and with the ACP and the European Union. The other part that speaks about migration and mobility is one that becomes a bottleneck, serious area for concern and attention that still continues to preoccupy the negotiators. I believe attention could be drawn to part 3 of the new agreement, back to the question of global alliances and international cooperation. That is simply the heart of which, if the ACP is to play a role as a global player, it must be addressing issues of, in fact, multilateralism. And that came to the fore in our most recent summit held in Nairobi, Kenya in December 2019, in which the role of the ACP as what I would call a catalyst, as a hub in multilateralism, but also a voice by which reforms of the UN, because the UN is at the center of multilateralism. But we cannot be naive and not understand multilateralism in its dynamic formation now of regional realignments or of emerging spheres of influence in Asia, where China emerges, what is happening into the Middle East and continues, where you can see Turkey as a middle-level power is also rolling it out. So it is a multilateralism with a new character that may be centripetal in sense of, while we see the importance of multilateralism and the UN system and all the UN system organizations, we have to see it in a much more dynamic and flexible way. And that is a challenge, I think, that needs serious attention and worthwhile engaging the minds and the intellectual capital of the Institute of International Relations with other institutes. This is why the regionalism, which is featured so prominently in how the new agreement is formulated, plays a part in looking at comparative regionalism. What do we learn from each other, particularly across the ACP? And a good example is how Africa, in its tripartite relationship of the Economic Community for Africa, COMESA, and SADC, formed together a tripartite understanding of regionalism. What then is the regionalism of the 21st century, in which the Caribbean in particular, in general, and certainly the Institute of International Relations will play a part? That touches on that important section of global alliances and international cooperation. Remaining parts of the agreement will deal with development and means of cooperation, the financing. It remains unknown at this stage because an allocation of resources will have to come from the way in which the overall European Union budget, which covers a period of 7 years between 2021 and 2027, will be finalized. That is still a subject of debate. But significantly, again, a change has been made in how resources will come to the regions. That the EDF is abolished with the going out of the Cotonou Agreement. There is an instrument called the NDICI, a monstrous instrument, bureaucratic entanglements in it, Neighborhood Democratic International Development Cooperation, in which the Americas as a region is the one in which the Caribbean will have to attempt to find its resources. And Asia is a region in which the Pacific, and that is why we fought and battled, and in our allies in the European Parliament, we were able to and still hope there will be some pursuit of a ring-fenced allocation so the ACP as intra-ACP, as trans-regional, will have access to resources. Work in progress, tough negotiations still continue. The institutional framework basically reflects what is obtaining, where there is a council of ministers, and also at another level, a council of ambassadors, a level of senior officials in a committee, which overlooks, in fact, more or less, the management of the organization, the management of the treaty in between the periods when the council will meet. The council is proposed to meet every 3 years rather than consecutive years as holds now, or as may be required. There is also a joint parliamentary assembly that has now been acknowledged as an important part. In all of the regional protocols, they will have reflecting the similar type of institutional organizations and institutional structure that is covered by the main document. I believe also we should try to move ahead more quickly because for the sake of having an opportunity for discussion, I would like us to look more closely at what I want to see and some aspects of the institutional architecture that I've touched on very briefly, but where there are some commonalities and some specificities. And for the purposes of therefore just briefly referring to those, I think that we can see there is as much attention on aspects of human rights and also the way in which the conceptualization of an African protocol sees its strategic priorities, first looking and putting very prominently in its strategic priorities, inclusive and sustainable economic growth and development, a title under which there are several chapters. Also, it's human and social development, environment and natural resources management and climate change, peace and security, allowing therefore in those categories or those sections to build on existing institutions in the African Union, such as an Africa Peace and Security Architecture, an African Governance Architecture, but again reflecting also human rights, democracy and governance, and migration and mobility, seen of course from the way in which the displaced persons and the larger number of migrants are within the continent rather than coming from the continent of Africa to Europe. I believe also I should make reference to the way in which the strategic priorities of the Caribbean Protocol are cited that complement but allow for the specificities. This is important for us to say there needs to be, in this new agreement, addressing as much as the specific needs of regions, given the fact of this regional character, given also the fact of the multilateral framework in which we are all participating, but at the same time, some specificities. And therefore, for the Caribbean, we want to see very high up, strengthening a political partnership, underpinning effective dialogue to promote our common interests that would cut across what is beneficial for the region and also carried into the multilateral arena. Secondly, our deepening of economic relations must promote structural transformation and diversification and support also ways in which the inequality that's been coming about, even from the impact of globalization and trade and investment and room for the private sector is also clearly provided as an important priority. Improving environmental sustainability. Yes, we are exposed and we understand very much, and the resilience and the way in which we will address resilience has scope to be looked at. But also peaceful and secure societies, given the type of violence, the type of, in fact, highly regrettable and sad domestic violence, in contrast to the concerns for gender equality, looking at justice and governance, and including financial governance in terms of our tax questions and the way in which those matters are looked at in a much more partnership way, and at the same time, our legislation that is adequate. Investing in human and social development allows us to see ways in which we will include a discussion on social development that brings in our education institutions, our understanding of education and higher education, and links that with our diaspora as an important area that features among our strategic priorities. I am not entitled to or authorized in any way to give specificities, but want to show that the scope is there for what this new agreement provides, not only to deepen the unity and solidarity, but to find how there are comparative advantages, how there will be specificities. It brings me therefore to really saying, when we look at the opportunities that will be presented under this new agreement, what is the role or the specific role that the Caribbean in general and an institute such as the Institute of International Relations and the entire apparatus of the university and other universities for its human capital to examine regionalism, to critically assess that. In fact, a significant development in the new amended Georgetown Agreement speaks of a consultative organ called the Interregional Organizations Coordinating Committee. The Interregional Organizations Coordinating Committee played a tremendously important role because that was a device used before the council meeting in Lomé, Togo, with the tensions between the African Union Commission and the ACP. A convening of that meeting allowed to hammer out, but also allowed to convey the understanding that Cotonou is an agreement of member states. It is not that it questions a continent-to-continent relationship of Africa with Europe, but within the Cotonou Agreement and within what is going forward, the ACP framework, that is why in the wisdom of the African heads of state, they said the negotiations would be held under the ACP framework. The opportunity now is to see how within that framework there is greater engagement to look at complementarity as the principle of subsidiarity. And complementarity will be necessary if we are to reap the benefits of trans-regional relations. But we also have a unique aspect of the Caribbean. What are we to do of Europe's presence in the Caribbean, not only in this formal way, but where the OCT countries, and also the step that has been made by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the ECS, and the relationship of Martinique and Guadeloupe? What are we to do about also Cayenne? Where do we see our relationship in building how that is, without at the same time not having the unique identity and character of the Caribbean? I want to try and wrap up the discussion more to benefit from the exchange of views. But in doing so, I must say, Professor Byron and Anita, I believe there's great scope for collaboration among higher institutions. The University of Guyana now takes a turn on the new leadership, Anton de Kom University in Suriname, and these have been not benefiting as enough as they can. I know that there is on the EduLink and previous opportunities of the current EDF to share it. But it seems to me now the critique within the Caribbean of what regionalism is doing and the organs and institutions of organizations and how they are able to benefit from a comparative analysis in Africa and also in the Pacific. In that way, the sea will not only be playing a key part as a catalyst, but really cementing the ACP to enhance its unity and solidarity. I want to say at that stage, thank you very much for an opportunity to be sharing some ideas of a perspective and to give a flavor of what we look forward to in a very important development of the ACP and the European Union at this stage. Thank you very much.
Very much, Ambassador Gomes. You for a wide-ranging overview of not only the history of EU-ACP relations, but of the current work in progress towards constructing a new and ongoing valuable relationship and collaboration between these two groups of countries. Now, there are a number of questions. I'm going to start by giving them two at a time, I think. The first one is slightly unusual. It comes from Kerry Baines, who would like some advice from you to young individuals establishing a diplomatic career. What sort of daily activities should they engage in that would cause organizations like the Institute of International Relations to wish to promote and support them in their way forward? That is the first one. And of course, I can always add a word on what kind of support we can offer as well. The second one is from Dr. Karen Niles, who wants to know if you are arguing that the initial non-reciprocal agreements encouraged the continuing export of primary products and stifled industrialization and the development of more sophisticated products. So I'll start there.
Thank you very much. And I could touch on the second question first. No, non-reciprocal enabled the developing countries to have access on a preferential arrangement. But the WTO says you cannot discriminate among developing countries by the enabling clause. That is why there had to be a waiver if the European Union was to continue. And therefore you have to pursue regional trade agreements so that substantially all trade between the two would still allow a special arrangement. What I'm arguing is that even though the non-reciprocal meant that you did not give preferences to Europe in what it was exporting to the ACP, they only were buying primary commodities, or the restrictions around the purchase were not with value addition. The negotiation of that had to be fought successfully, I think, in the money that was used for sugar to move itself up into its value chain and to find its relationship in Mauritius with a buyer in Europe, Terios, but also in dealing with the diamonds negotiation, the arrangements that the Botswana country had with the bears. So yes, it restricted, though it gave you, the preferences were ephemeral. That's what I'm saying. The preference is ephemeral. If you're only getting a preference over the raw cocoa, that then is able to use all the milk of Switzerland, and you buy back the chocolates. Until now, in Cote d'Ivoire, as in Ghana, the upgrading of their primary commodity enters under the tariffs, that not because the preference has been eroded so significantly, the preference that you gain under the EPA is minimal to what you send as a finished product, and therefore the investment and development. The first question about development of a diplomatic career, I believe it's so fascinating that you read and read and read as much as you can. My sense is I began to look at the book of Sir Sridhar Ramphal, Glimpses of Global Life. It's fascinating to read a bit about that. And also former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson now has his political journey. I know when you had the Comlit, I followed it a bit on TV. So do read either around personalities, but I'm biased that way. That is why my work I did around C.L.R. James, because I wanted to see what he did and how he conceptualized it. But it's good in developing a diplomatic career to know the area in which you want to look at, geographic and also thematic, and read as much as you can. And I think that will be very significant. And then attend to all the courses that are being offered here in the Institute of International Relations, and ensure that you're getting all A's in the courses from Dr. Mantut and Professor Byron.
Add to that, the Institute provides periodically internships that are available to people who are interested in this kind of work, internships, and also we do a lot of mentoring, both formal and informal, and these are important mechanisms for developing one's expertise and in helping to prepare oneself for a diplomatic career. Now, I've been asked to remind viewers that they can use the raise hand tool, and the technicians will allow you to voice your questions, and please ensure that there is no background noise. Now, question 3, Ambassador, comes from Professor Patsy Lewis, who says, why are we still looking to the European Union for our resources? Do we foresee a time when we will no longer rely on the EU as the source of resources? Guyana has chosen not to leave its vast oil resources in the ground. Surely it should no longer need EU development resources. What of the blue economy? I would like to hear your vision of what a future without EU resources would look like. So that's question 3, and question 4 from Lygia Smith. In these times of the pandemic, how can an organization like the OACPS support its members, especially those that are struggling? Are there some initiatives coming from within the group? So those are 2 pretty substantial questions.
Louis, I'll come to that after. But I know the ACP, I speak only in an informal and a personal capacity, convened an extraordinary and special summit given the COVID and what is happening. And therefore, I don't know specifically what arrangements are being made, but they're being taken into account that there must be some way of looking at it. But I should say, strengthening of health systems is a program that has received funding of 150 million euros to deal with health systems. Nothing more important here than the exchange of information, the role that has been played, the role played in the Ebola outbreak and dealing with Ebola. Yes, to look at COVID now, if I may give a reference, Professor Janka, Charles Janka at University Charité, that is a joint teaching university in Germany, in Berlin, is the same university hospital that Navalny just ended up in. In fact, Professor Janka is constantly doing weekly updates, and his reference is there available on aspects of COVID they're dealing with and how it can be. Concretely, I do not know what are the measures that can be taken to give immediate relief, other than that we have to try and deal with COVID as much as possible in terms of its prevention and following the WHO. Come to Professor Lewis. Yes, we are not still looking to Europe for, in fact, a handout at all. There are several levels at which the relationship of developed and developing countries can be looked at. One of which is way back in the Monterey Consensus on Development. They have an obligation. 0.7% of GNI or ODA, of GNP, whichever it is to be contributed for development assistance. So they have a moral obligation. We must live that. We must emphasize, and I'm agreeing with you very closely, much more South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation exchange not only experiences, but also to look at ways in which things can be done better. South-South and triangular cooperation, yes. Thirdly, the reference to Guyana. I'm not in a position to say as yet what it will be done, but all the more reason why, with the growth this year anticipated of 22% in GDP, how that oil and gas sector is managed, which reinforces the point I'm making now. The management of it should also involve and make room for the experience of what has happened in other developing countries. And seminars are being held at UG, webinars on, in fact, the Dutch disease and the curse of the new resources. But also there is going to be with Guyana, the carpetbaggers are on the track already. The way in which they're looking at and seeing to grab and to get those resources. Therefore, there is reason for a CARICOM to play a role, and hopefully, I like to think between Trinidad and Tobago, what I call the Southern Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, it's oil and gas, diversifying its economy, Guyana now emerging in oil and gas, and Suriname, Guyana and Suriname are taking a lot more. I see, therefore, a lot more CARICOM discussions about how the resources can best be put to use, and we will encourage, and I think it's very good that we should do that. I would not want us to discredit Europe. As you know, the Dominican Republic, the trade relations between the ACP and Europe are substantial. 75.2 billion was 2019 total trade. EU's exports were 78.7 billion. We must optimize and make the best of those. The Dominican Republic has done tremendously with its benefit of the EPA, and it has grown as much as possible. So where we can optimize the relationship with Europe on trade, development, cooperation, on technology, it should be to our benefit, but not at all to perpetuate a mendicant approach.
Thank you. There are a number of questions coming in, so maybe I'll go to 3 questions at a time. Yes. First, Zainab Nakid. What does the Council have in place to ensure that the EU fully compensates the ACP countries for our past colonization? Next, from Dr. Anthony Gonzalez. Would separate funding arrangements for each region without the EDF not lead to the further erosion of development assistance to the Caribbean? And question 7, and I think I'm going to ask Joel Richards, whose hand has been up for some time, to voice his question. This would be question number 7. Joel, can you hear me? And can you voice your question? Still muted.
Unmute your microphone, please, Joel.
Sorry. Okay, my apologies. Yes, good afternoon to everyone. And thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very good presentation. You did mention multilateralism, and I'm particularly interested in the trade aspect of multilateralism. And my question really is, how do we ensure that there is greater coherence between what the ACP and the EU are doing in Brussels vis-a-vis what they are doing in Geneva in the context of the WTO?
well by saying, yes, there are disagreements in terms of what is happening in WTO now, but the reform program, the reform of the WTO is essential, very necessary. The WTO and our Geneva office has been in the forefront in terms of partly organizing and facilitating that ACP group, which has played an important part. Again, the ACP group as part of the wider G90 in the time of one of the earlier Secretary Generals, Ambassador Golangana. But the trade facilitation agreement in Bali could not have been accepted if it hadn't the benefit of the G90 in which the ACP played a part. Similarly now, the battle on fishing subsidies for, in fact, artisanal fishing subsidies, we are advocating and pushing to go forward. There is basic disagreement with how the WTO is, how the larger countries are seeing the WTO to look at forgetting the Doha agenda, the development slipping off of it. Therefore, there are points in which there'll be agreement and other points in which there'll be disagreement. And that is what happens in how you negotiate in the multilateral trading system. But an insistence together between the European Union and the ACP, not only the ACP and several other developing countries, that we need a dispute settlement mechanism. And we do need a WTO that is strong, and we cannot accept the fact that we will all land ourselves into protectionist approaches or to individual trade agreements, that we need a multilateral trading system, and a rule-based system has to be advocated and pushed for, and there will be differences now around, and where there are now excessive subsidies, we have to fight against that and continue to disagree on that point. I missed the second question, but I come to the compensation for past colonialism. There is no provision in the Council, and that issue of reparations has not been in the forefront of the agenda, but it is one that is duly to be considered and worked on. But there is no provision in the Council to address it. The sixth question.
Ambassador, would separate funding arrangements for each region without the EDF not lead to the further erosion of development assistance to the Caribbean? Maybe I should add to that because it's along the same lines. Question 7 from Lynette Reed. Is the budgetization of the EDF and the regional focus of the EU Commission's proposed NDC, which you mentioned earlier, instrument as concern to the post-Cotonou negotiations? For instance, there is no regional ACP-specific earmark for the future budget. The Pacific is grouped with Asia, the Caribbean is grouped with Africa, with Latin America, and Africa is a region in itself. Perhaps you might want to elaborate a bit more on that, and maybe look at the Caribbean, the outlook for the Caribbean.
EDF, an advantage as tied to specifically the voluntary contribution of member states to fund the agreement from Lomé. In fact, the EDF began with the Rome Treaty of '57 and providing for what were the associates, those that were part of the Yaoundé Convention. Now, but the Parliament has always resisted that by saying any penny of taxpayers must be subject to scrutiny and must not be left exclusively for the executive. The EDF executive, meaning the member states and the Council and the European Commission, controlled it. Complex rules and regulations. Yes. So the Parliament opposed and repeatedly fought against it. We do face a disadvantage, but at the same time, we have to be creative. We have to negotiate. That is why the Parliament on our side for a joint parliamentary assembly was in disagreement with the ACP because the ACP would have liked to see the EDF continued. The member states, the Council, the mood in Europe is not for. Even early on, you see the composition of the EDF. The composition of Europe we have to take into account. And I refer to Europe is going through its own struggle for its identity. It's caught between China and the USA. What it is, it's a large trading bloc. It has to embrace, it is concerned about, yes, developing countries, not morally, but to advance its trading interests. We therefore have to negotiate on the basis of what is in the agreement. That is why where there are strategic priorities articulated as a basis for engaging, and this is to be member state driven, we have in the OACPS now responsibilities to find the ways by which the combination of working together will be able to access support for. So the Parliament disagreeing with keeping an EDF, but being our ally, that is a composition of how you negotiate, being our ally to see that there should be some ring fencing. I don't think it has been successful as yet, but the fact that the JPA is included as an institution gives us the scope to put onto the agenda. In fact, it was in the EPA's, Guyana's position was defended very much by the committee in the Parliament when we disagreed on what was happening with the EPAs and how there were sympathetic views. The broad mass of 700 parliamentarians, now the Greens have come to the fore, the Liberals, but we are dealing with an environment very much protectionist. Therefore, how do we put our resources to leverage and negotiate within the Parliament to succeed with what we want to accomplish? So regrettable, but we must find a way.
That sounds to me, Ambassador, as if our Caribbean parliamentarians need to be much more aware of all of these issues in order to very skillfully represent the concerns of their regions in joint parliamentary association meetings. That there's a considerable amount of diplomacy to be done at the parliamentary level, I would think, and preparation for these meetings.
When we did some early work on Caribbean integration, what has happened to the Caribbean Assembly? The parliamentarians that were to meet, and where were they? So the executive and the legislative bodies do have their tensions, but now the fact that even from the time of Cotonou, there was room being made for local authorities, for municipalities to have a room, as seen appropriate by the executive. They must make the demands, and that is why I think strengthening of the parliamentarians are very, very important. Yes.
That in recent years, the parliamentary assembly that has met more frequently has been the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Parliamentary Grouping. I can't recall the last meeting of a CARICOM Parliamentary Assembly. 4, does the ACP group under the new agreement have the capacity and objective of promoting both intra-regional integration and inter-regional trade? Specifically, can the ACP inject new life into the CSME? That is one. And I'm going to give you 2 more. In Dr. Gonzalez, in a context of declining trade and development assistance between the EU and the Caribbean, what is now the real value of any new ACP-EU agreement? And there's a question from St. Lucia, Charlene Regis. What would be the realistic potential benefits of the agreement for our small island states with respect to agriculture and manufacturing within the constraints of logistics and the inability to produce the quantities that may be requested? So you have a mouthful.
Which is on the question of scale for the agriculture, the third question, the scope. The scope is there, but it's a question that has to be seen from the technological side, from the policy side, and the organizational side. I don't think we have given much credence and effort to how we would organize regional agricultural enterprises and commodities for a specific market. other than the time when sugar was very high. We were very well organized, and the Sugar Association of the Caribbean now has to make sure that it remains organized. So that is the question of organization. The question of technology is very important. What are the technologies to add value to? And here I would want to say a question I used to raise as a hybrid or an outsider to the Faculty of Agriculture, being a member of the Faculty in Agriculture Extension. I said, when are we going to have the orchards of Caimite? When are we going to have orchards cultivating, in fact, sapodilla? When are we going to have orchards of the exotic fruit, if we were to? Then we have, therefore, that's the technology applied for a particular product which is in high demand. I'm sure you realize we're getting coconut water now in a can, or you can get coconut water that's coming from Thailand or coming from somewhere in the Pacific and bought maybe on a shelf in somewhere in the Caribbean, certainly drunk in Miami. My point is that until we take agriculture serious in its multifunctional and its multidimensional aspect, and look at how you can combine what has happened to the JAGRO initiative. The first level in the JAGRO initiative was an agriculture modernization fund. The modernization fund did not see an iota of support in the Caribbean Development Bank because the concern there was with infrastructure and how can we get the airport? How can we have the one, I wanted to say perhaps in Bequia, but I'm not sure where it would be. But where could we find, in other words, until the orientation to a progressive agriculture industrialization, agriculture industrial sector. Professor Dr. Deep Ford is writing on this in cassava. Don't forget that the Eastern Caribbean came to bananas after sugar. It had a way in dealing with sugar. It came to bananas. It is moving out of. What are we to do with the cocoa and the spices of Grenada and where else? In other words, it is a complex question, a great demand, technology, organization, policy, and political will at the highest level. Now, the question about real benefits by Professor Dr. Gonzalez. My sense is that if such a question is posed to a high middle income country like the Bahamas or Botswana, and you ask them, membership of an intergovernmental organization is not primarily around monetary benefits. It's much more political and diplomatic. I tell you why it is. It is not without reason that the 79 may now play a significant part, and Africa may now play a significant part in who will head the WTO, the candidacy. The candidacy for international organizations always relies and depends on the numbers. I know that. Graziano da Silva could not have been the Director General of the FAO if he did not have the full backing of the ACP. And he got that. We were there for the vote. And it was 13. And they wondered why the ACP was not supporting the Spanish candidate, former Spanish foreign minister. And we came together in a cluster and a caucus, and it was Graziano da Silva from Brazil. So there are benefits that will come. But also, let us look at the more important dimension. I think, Peter, if CARICOM had not existed and did not play a role in the political impasse in Guyana, we may have been in a very awkward situation. There was no particular monetary benefit, but we can rely on the leadership that came in and demand that a recount, and the role that was played by the leadership of CARICOM, and the role that is now playing by CARICOM in the leadership both of Prime Minister Motley, her reference, as I try to quote her, on a reinvigorated multilateralism, how she addressed the IDB, even if we lost on the candidacy of who is the president of the IDB, because Trump had his way. The way in which it can be used must come from us having clear positions of our objectives and bringing together the numbers. So real benefits come not only as monetary, but in the diplomatic world and for also other aspects. The capacity to support the CSME. Some capacity is there. When you look at that section or that title in the new agreement, that is why it is moved from trade
Hello, good evening, attendees. Just give us 1 minute to see what's going on at the Institute of International Relations. I see that the screen seems to be frozen.
We seem to have had a break in transmission, but we are reconnected and we are going to continue the discussion. Ambassador, I'm not sure if you remember where you were, or should I just go on? Should I just continue with the questions?
Gafu on the CSME, and saying that we really cannot do that without identifying a policy for Caribbean agriculture, what areas of agriculture, what aspect of Caribbean agriculture in its value addition, etc. we want to do, and seeing how the combination will make a difference.
I have a few more questions. I think these are the last on our list. I'm going to start with the person who has not asked a question before. Indira Jagasar wants to know if social entrepreneurship can help embed the principle of subsidiarity in development. So that's the first question. And who would like you to elaborate on how effective can a trading relationship be between the CARICOM region and he mentions African Horn countries, but you might wish to discuss. We've gone again? Yes. There's a question from Kerry Baines on the effectiveness of the trade relationships between the CARICOM region and African countries, and if there can be sustainable growth coming out of greater trade volumes between the Caribbean and Africa. And there are two very controversial questions from Dr. Gonzalez, but very interesting. The first one is interesting in the light of your earlier reference, Ambassador, to Guyana and the impasse over Guyana's elections. Dr. Gonzalez says, of what value is an agreement which now shifts more to human rights, peace and security, and political dialogue, issues which are of much less concern for the Caribbean? But of course, that is debatable. And he has a last question. What constitutes the loss, if any, for the Caribbean with the departure of the UK? So, Ambassador, over to you. You exercise your mind in answering these.
Trying to start with Dr. Gonzalez's questions always are troublesome. But as you know, a carryover of the EPA, the CARIFORUM EPA, has been successfully put on the table as a framework for what happens post-Brexit. Yes, the loss is significant. The contribution as the third largest economy in Europe, France, Germany, the UK, are the three big ones. Yes, but I think that is so much depending on what comes out of how is the withdrawal agreement satisfied with the UK and Europe, Global Britain. I believe that there is room, since already a framework has been made for how CARICOM or CARIFORUM will relate to Britain, to pursue that. The loss on the part is a weaker Europe, no doubt, but also we would have to see what will be the way in which the reliance on the UK market, the heavily dependent UK market that is certainly out of Belize's sugar, I would say, the fruit out of Caribbean, on the ACP side, the horticulture products out of East Africa and Kenya has to be looked at, has to be negotiated. But it means, again, what will be the objectives being pursued under trade, investment, and diversification as building niches and building ways in which you are participating effectively and concentrated on what aspect of the global value chain. This is being done quite successfully between Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana with relation to cocoa. In fact, the value addition that has been increasing, I had some figures at hand that I can't place now, but that's an example of what is being done. It's an example of how it can be done. More importantly, I think that Peter Gonzalez is getting at is the relationship of human rights. There is no sustainable development without peace and security. But peace and security call for sustainable development. They're interrelated. In that sense, the political dialogue, if we have all agreed that we want to subscribe to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals mean that multilateralism requires support to address our planet on climate change. This agreement enhances that. In fact, it enhances the relationship with Europe in its new Green Deal. It enhances the relationship in which, again, to me, the intellectual capacity of the Caribbean must tap into in collaboration with Europe on the 80 billion. They see the technology. They see that they have to do research and innovation. The Joint Research Center of Europe, we must participate in that. They have an atlas on every aspect of the soil and forests. So it is very much an organizing and targeting how you want to do the work. That was done, I think, in U.W.I under Wayne Hunt. There must have been more, 2 or 3 million on the EduLink, the higher education, research, science, and technology, and various areas. There's now the Research and Innovation Fund. So my sense has always been how you organize your case. Europe understands that. It has survived so far by negotiating and finding compromise. Dr. Arak Singh would help us here. When the Sugar Protocol, they asked us to renounce it, and we said no. In saying no, we earned 1.2 billion euros. And Dr. Arak Singh and the Minister of Guyana and others would have traveled to the European capitals. That money did not come from the EDF. It was so necessary they found it in their own BCI, out of the purse of Europe, to accept the fact that the sugar, 18 countries in the working group in sugar would not denounce the Sugar Protocol. They found 1.2 billion. Now the question comes, Professor, what did we do with it? I have to say, and I say it, we regret. We did not put it to use other than Mauritius, other than Eswatini, Swaziland now. They've grown more than 200% in what they're doing. South Africa coming in. So it all depends on when resources we got, what do we do with the resources, how we negotiate to get the resources, but must have the sense of continuity and not a 3-year or 4-year cycle to drop it at the beginning, a flavor of the month. We cannot do that. The way in which there must be sustained activity over a period of time to carry it to its fruition. I think that effect of trade relations between CARICOM was asked by Mr. Baines.
The Caribbean and the African countries.
Well, scope, sorry. Depending very much on the sector and very much on the area, I believe that there are very good indications of how Ghana and Trinidad and Tobago are developing their relations. Banking sector, some aspects of the oil, I think also in the cocoa. So it isn't that there are not possibilities in the scope, it's how systematically, how critically we look at it and how we want to stay with it to pursue it. So yes, the effect of the trade relations can be negative, but the trade relations under EPA for the Dominican Republic have been highly rewarding, and they are making use of it. And therefore, we must look to see what are the products. We have a constraint in terms of size and transportation. Those are structural constraints, how you address them, where the technology plays a part, but organizing and how you organize it to ensure that the benefits can be reaped. Social entrepreneurship. Yes, it must be seen as a principle in terms of subsidiarity, what can be done at the lower level. And again, we must identify what areas or what aspects of the social entrepreneurship to look at investing and what sides of health, investing in what areas that the entrepreneur, and I think that's an important point drawn to my attention, Professor Byron, when we were talking about the way in which we've seen the diaspora. And the diaspora is as many much the level of the small persons who worked in the quote unquote developed the metropolitan country and had their savings and used their savings to invest. And on retirement, they've invested. And yes, that could be organized. It's being done in Africa in a significant way between some aspects of the Cameroon that I know of, some aspects of Kenya. So there's great scope again for how that entrepreneurship can be done, identifying the issue, the goals, over what period of time, and marshalling the resources, but organized in a way in which that principle of subsidiarity and complementarity will work for it.
We are nearing the end of our question time. I would like to give Dr. Montoute the opportunity to pose one more question, if we can impose on your goodwill, Ambassador. And that will be our final question for this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ambassador, for this enlightening presentation as well as your response to the questions. We have been in this relationship with the European Union since, well, the EC at the time, since 1975, and we've been collaborating ACP since that time. And we know that while the regions and while the countries have made some progress, some fundamental development problems remain. And I am a firm believer in, local and national, we're taking national responsibility for our development, but I also believe that we can also, and we should use external relationships and cooperation for taking off in terms of our development. Now, as I said in the beginning, some fundamental problems remain, even if we have made some progress. What hope do you have that this new relationship and this new dispensation is going to take us on a path, to take us on a path to experience a boost and a transformation in our development? And if you can identify maybe one or two elements of that you think would really play a role in taking us off from these development challenges that we have been struggling with, even if we've had those relationships that were supposed to have really enhanced or boosted or taken us on a path of genuine and long-lasting and sustainable transformation in our development process.
Dr. Montoute is putting your finger on the pulse. First one, yes, there is great scope in this agreement on the issue of local content. Local content. And that is coming to the fore. It's being negotiated in a very stringent and a harsh and a rigorous way. Local content must be there in terms of foreign direct investment. We're not going for trade and investment industrialization, but on the investment, and a big debate goes around responsible investment. What are the terms and conditions? What go into the ways in which the investment agreements, there where the lawyers have to play a part. So the intellectual capital must see what it is. We cannot allow a rip-off of 2% royalty for what is to come out of the petroleum block in Guyana, when an average nationally is 12% internationally. How can it be? What agreement has been negotiated to allow that? And we've seen in the newspapers, Guyana read, of benefiting what has happened in Senegal and how they're approaching it in Papua New Guinea and so forth. They're combining South-South cooperation for the knowledge exchange is important. So local content will be an area that this agreement provides scope for enhancing, that we've really brought to bear. And local content is not meaning to employ 5 more supervisors when they're building a road or a factory. It means looking at the heart of the management of the policy of what is going to be used in the resources. I think there is enormous potential in terms of the blue economy, the oceans, the narrative of the blue Pacific that they're speaking about, That is why such a battle was fought while I was there on deep sea mining and the objection to it. Of course, it has to take into account the environment, how they're resisting it. They don't have the ocean anymore. The ocean is to fight with them and France and the UK about fish and so on. We're looking at the mineral below the surface. Therefore, the blue economy has tremendous. Harnessing the blue economy is a tremendous discussion with UNCTAD playing a key part that we discussed already. So there's scope there. The scope is there to show us, in other words, that our resources are in fact to the fore. They could not have developed without access to all the minerals of Africa. And that must be shown to have the value due to them from where they are. And that again comes to what is negotiated related to our policy, but the skill and the expertise. And that is why I come back to the intellectual capital, the capital accumulation. Is it volume 1 or not? Commodity for the production of commodities that he wrote about, but how we see the accumulation of capital. Now it's human capital that is accumulated from our experience in dealing with this, put on the table to drive us forward. The comparative regionalism, therefore, of understanding. Dr. Harold Singh is here with us in terms of competition commissions, how we've been functioning, what aspects, our weaknesses, how we learn and convey those competition commissions for other countries now that are signing trade agreements. Therefore, the scope is there, how we organize, what issue, and how we want to pursue it in a sustainable and consistent way over a period of time. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. There is one hand up. Would you permit one last?
Yes.
This is really the last question.
Yes.
Alicia Shepherd, would you like to voice your question, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Byron. Good afternoon, Ambassador. It's quite an honor to ask this question and to be part of the discussion today. As a fellow Guyanese and also an alumna of the IIR Institute, I am especially interested in the cultural shift that is particularly needed at this time, given everything that's happening in the global space. We see how it is that in developed countries, that the man on the ground, the man in the street, are making demands for change to our structural changes to our institutions, to the way we do things historically and even at present. My question, Ambassador, is given everything that we've explained today, how is it that we can make the shifts on the ground? Because, for example, we're talking about historical corruption in public institutions. We're talking about, let's take Guyana, for example, historical racism within the framework of even the government institutions. How is it that we can move ourselves, propel ourselves forward, even in light of all this aid and development assistance that we're getting or have been getting? I believe that the question is really, how do we propel ourselves, starting from the average man in the street? What solutions can you offer us in terms of moving ahead with the cultural shifts that are needed in the mindset of the people? Thank you.
Yeah. I do agree that you're touching on the most very fundamental aspect of a cultural shift, we must demonstrate the example will be the shift. The example of a shift that comes about where the young entrepreneur who's supposed to be a 7 or 8 year old in Tobago doing some farming, but also where there's been success in terms of organizing oneself to accomplish a goal. That shift will come. It is not only, I don't subscribe comfortably to the view that the attitude must change. The attitude psychologically relates to the material resources and the benefits that are felt on the ground. You know, our teaching and adoption of innovations and so forth come from us seeing the opportunity, by which this will bring real benefits to me. There's a choice of certain areas. I listened to a young Sanatan, I think, discussing an aspect in one of the panel discussions around the COMLIT. Organizing, again, if I'm repeating it, it's a stale tune. Organizing around an issue that we see as important and explain it to let the consciousness about it, to build the consciousness, the pedagogy of the oppressed, that he was able to teach what Paulo Freire is showing, teaching the peasantry literacy on the basis of understanding water, because water is life to them, because they lived in the arid parts. So what are successful cases become a momentum that will then diffuse a successful innovation. Yes, leadership is important, and leadership together around an issue, and that is why in the university it has a role to play. It must play a role, and it is not necessarily a role that is played by, first of all, noise on the street, but the good work that organizes, that allows the policy to change and to demonstrate. The work that George Sammy was doing in terms of the technology, the work that has been done elsewhere, the development of the pigeon pea, the dwarf pigeon pea, we did not stay with it long enough, etc. So my sense is identifying an issue, marshal the resources around it, and staying with it over a period of time. It needs consistency, it needs pursuit, but the focus of what one wants to achieve. Thank you.
That is how the cultural shift will take place, not by a miracle, but by long, hard, sustained, disciplined work. Ambassador, thank you very much. You've been extremely patient, and we've had a wide-ranging discussion. And I think that I've been very heartened to see that our the people asking questions have come from all over the Caribbean and much further afield, and the questions have been wide-ranging. So I'd like to really thank our audience for engaging so enthusiastically in the discussion today. And I now call on Ms. Zainab Nakid, one of our students in the postgraduate diploma program. Good afternoon, Zainab. And Zainab will be giving the vote of thanks to bring an end to this webinar. Over to you, Zainab.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to Professor Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations, His Excellency, Dr. Patrick Ignatius Gomes, other distinguished guests, the Secretariat staff of the IIR, other staff and students of the IIR, and of course, the staff and students of the U.W.I. It is my privilege to be able to give a few words of thanks at this event. I, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, would like to extend our sincerest thanks to His Excellency for his informative dialogue on the ACP-EU relations and negotiations of a post-Cotonou partnership agreement. As students of international relations, we must always be aware of developments across the international political economy, and especially those that affect our Caribbean region. I think that I speak on behalf of my fellow classmates when I say that this lecture was particularly informative for us, since we recently had discussions around this topic in our international development course. When Dr. Gomes mentioned the unity and solidarity, a main tenets that holds the ACP group of countries together, I felt a sense of pride, because solidarity is a way to ensure that we aren't taken advantage of by these stronger countries. We are stronger together. This was a position that I had not really considered before. As future IR scholars, diplomats, and leaders, knowing these things can only be advantageous to us in our future careers. I would like to think that all participants of this virtual dialogue learned something from your dialogue today. Increasing our awareness of our own region's affairs informs and empowers us to make better critical decisions that can impact our region's future. Once again, we are extremely grateful for your knowledge, time, insight, and perspective. Thank you very much.
And this brings to a close our first diplomatic dialogue for this academic year. Thank you very much, everyone who has attended. And once again, Ambassador, thank you very much for having launched us so well this afternoon, and to everyone else who has participated in this afternoon's proceedings. Thank you and goodbye from the Institute of International Relations.